Okay, hello friends, and welcome to the Chabura. For those who are here for the first time, we're an online Bet Midrash comprised of international students offering cutting-edge Torah for you to learn anytime, anywhere. Just to note to say that if you're watching or hearing this public shiur on YouTube or podcast, we have a whole range of exclusive classes for our members that are not publicly available. In order to access these members-only classes, you can become a member at thechabura.com/join, and I'll put the link in the chat box. There you'll discover the benefits of becoming a Chabura member, which includes a unique curriculum of classes in video and podcast form, a free book shipped to you each year, the opportunity to write for our journals and books, and to connect with hundreds of like-minded individuals from over 20 countries. We don't make profit from any of our projects, so we appreciate the support of our members in ensuring the Chabura continues to provide cutting-edge Torah to a global audience. So, if you enjoy what we're doing at the Chabura, please consider becoming a member today in time for our new curriculum beginning in September. Visit our website to find out more. Moving on to tonight. Tonight we have the privilege of having two incredible individuals who really do not need any introduction. Our Rosh Bet Midrash, Senior Rabbi Joseph Dweck, and a leading scholar and expert in the field, Professor Moshe Halbertal. Tonight we will be discussing the fascinating topic of the Jews of Provence and the confluence of culture between Ashkenazim and Sepharadim. Thank you so much everyone for coming. And with that, I will hand it over. Rabbi, bechavod.
Thank you very much, as always, Ohad, for the wonderful introduction and for everybody who's here to be able to share in this discussion between Professor Halbertal and myself. I'm going to ask you, Rabbi Ohad, are you going to spotlight the professor and me? Both
of you are pinned.
We're pinned. Okay. So Professor, before I come, to open the discussion with you, I feel that I'm obligated to say to everybody that's here, and what I say is really not even appropriately representing what the praise that the professor requires, but I will say to all of the people here that among the books that the professor has written, and everything that he's written is so erudite and so clear and so well-founded that I mean, you really should be reading everything that he wrote. But there's one book for me that stands out, and that is the book that he wrote on Harambam, on Maimonides. And for me, it is the single most excellent book that I have ever read on Harambam's Torah. And if you have not read his book on Harambam, you must read his book on Harambam. Otherwise, you don't know Harambam's Torah. You have to be able to see this in order to understand. So for me, it is always a tremendous kavod to be able to share time with Professor Halbertal, to be able to discuss Inyane Torah with him. And I'm very grateful, Professor, for taking the time to be able to sit and discuss with us tonight the Jews of Provence and Judaism that was running in Provence. But you are the expert on this in this area between the two of us, and I'm really here to learn from you and to be able to kind of engage in a bit of discussion, to be able to better unpack for our tzibur the life and times of that remarkable area and remarkable period. So I guess I will open with you and ask you, you wrote a book focusing on the Meiri, but, I'm going to open it for you and ask you, where would you like to dive in tonight? Where would you like to dive in tonight?
Oh, thank you. Thank you for the invitation to study and converse with you. And thank you for the warm welcoming and hospitality. It's really an honor to be among you and to have a conversation with you. So thank you all. I think our starting point maybe should be the entry of the Olam of Andalus, the world of Andalus, to Provence.
So we're talking about towards the end of Harambam's life, if not after that. No, I mean around.
Actually, no, earlier. We're talking earlier. Okay. So let me describe a little bit the history, right? So Andalus is in South Spain, in the area of South Spain, where Jews are Sephardi Jews, right? Rambam always will call himself Moshe ben Maimon Sfaradi, always. Even when he's in Fustat in Cairo. This is a world of Judeo-Arabic culture. All great books in Jewish thought written in that area with immense influence on our life and Jewish tradition are written in Arabic with Hebrew letters. I'm talking about Bachya ibn Pekuda, Chovat Alvavot, Kuzari of Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, Emunot Vedeot of Rasag, written in another sphere, but also in Arabic, and then Moreh Nevuchim. So this is a Jews who are great Talmidei Chachamim, great thinkers, poets, philosophers, who are immersed in the Sephardi tradition of the Judeo-Arabic world.
Yeah.
That world is a separate cultural domain than the Jews of Europe, across the Pyrenees, or even North Spain, Castilla and Catalonia, and Provence, which is South France, which is under the dominion of the Christian world. And these are Jews who do not talk Arabic, do not read Arabic, and they have somehow a culture of their own. So we talk about two very distinct halachic, philosophical, theological worlds. Those worlds meet in a very complex and cultural encounter in Provence. How and why?
So before, if I can, Professor, before we talk about how they meet, can you speak a little bit about Provence itself? What's the, before the, the contact, or before the interaction, right, what is happening in Provence, right? Is it the same as all of the rest of Europe? We've got southern France over here. It's not necessarily it's not part of the northern France and the regime of the king. They have their own cities, and there seems to be, and again, your thoughts on this, but it seems to be that there was a period of flourishing, at least of Jewish life in this area.
Absolutely.
So they're studying and reading, but they're not necessarily. Maybe you can paint us a bit of a picture of southern France, of Provence.
What we have in places like Lunel, that's a very important place. Montpellier, Perpignan, Béziers. We have Narbonne. We have a whole. We have Jewish communities who have their own Torah learning and culture, and they are to a certain degree in the 11th century, in the shadow of northern France, where Rashi and the Tosafists are active, but they have their own rabbinic traditions and culture. And here we have to, as we're going to explain the situation, we get into very complex cultural reality. Just to add to the independent life of Provence, the early writings of Kabbalah, the first writings of Kabbalah as we know it, come from Provence. We would say the birthplace of Kabbalah is in Provence. Figures like Ravad, Ravi Avraham ben Yitzchak, Baal HaEshkol, Rabbi Avraham ben David, Rabbi Yitzchak Sagi Naor, all those figures are the first Kabbalists are known by names, and they are active in Provence. Now, at the time when the Rambam was young, around 1150, the Jewish world of Andalus is shattered by an invasion of a more radical Islamic movement called the Muhayyidun, that is we would say the Al-Qaeda of the medieval period, and they shatter the coexistence of Jews, Christian and Muslims under the Muslim rule in Andalus. And Jewish families began to disperse from that world. Cities like Cordoba, Granada, all these cities are really have such powerful, wonderful Jewish communities. They are completely shattered. This is, by the way, the end of Andalusian Jewry as we know it. Now,
so for all intents and purposes, Harambam literally watched the destruction of the entire world of Yahudut and Torah that he held so dear. That, you know, his reminiscence of Sepharadim, I mean, it ended when he was 20 years old.
Exactly.
So it was really a khurban for him.
Real khurban.
Yeah.
By the way, Maimonides, all his life, we have to remember, if we want to understand Rambam, he's a refugee, he's an immigrant. Right. From a great culture.
He never went down to Provence. Some of the others went down.
So here's the interesting thing. Maimon, his father, and the whole family moved from Cordoba to Fez, to the Maghreb, to Morocco, to today's Morocco.
Yeah.
But that's a strange route because they go into the eye of the storm. A lot of other Jewish families move north, cross the Pyrenees, and settle in the great Jewish communities of Provence. We're talking about great families of learning and culture.
Ibn Tibon.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Kimchi, Rabbi David Kimchi. These are great figures. They come with great learning. But they come to a world which is very different than their world. And here we start this Ashkenaz Sfarad story of Provence. I want to read you from the one text that is the most, that expresses in the deepest way that encounter from Yehuda ibn Tibon, right? Who's the father of Shmuel ibn Tibon. And Shmuel ibn Tibon, just to remind everyone, is the great translator of the Moreh Nevuchim, the Guide of the Perplexed, from Arabic to Hebrew. Yehuda ibn Tibon arrives to Provence, and he says, in his introduction to his translation of Chovot Halvavot from Arabic to Hebrew, he says, וגם בארץ אדום הייתה פלטה לשאר עמנו. Also בארץ אדום, which means in the Christian land, there was a refuge to all our people, והיו בהם חכמים גדולים בחוכמת התורה והתלמוד מימים קדמונים. They had great scholars in the wisdom and learning of Torah and Talmud from ancient days. אך לא היו מתעסקים בחוכמות אחרות. They didn't occupy themselves with other wisdoms. Here is already...
This is Ibn Tibon
right.
testifying to the fact, right? He's saying it explicitly.
Yeah, he said, these are insulated Jews. They were never exposed to large wisdoms.
Right.
And he says, מפני שהייתה תורה אומנותה, תורתם אומנותם, the Torah was their only occupation, ומפני שלא היו ספרי חוכמות אחרות נמצאים אצלם. Basically, if we want to say it in our words, they belong to a backward world.
Right.
Culturally.
Well, you say backward, I think, that's a charged word. So I think it's important to know, and I recognize that's, but it's important to, I think, to unpack a bit what we mean by that, right? I mean,
Right.
If we are in a place, right, in which there is no access to worldly knowledge, or even if there is somewhat, which is debatable, we can speak on that. The Jewish people are not looking into that they're only studying Torah, and they're only studying Torah, interestingly, in Hebrew. So they're not even, right, they're not writing in the vernacular, the way that the Rambam is.
Right.
They are closed. Yeah, and so what you're reading is that Ibn Tibbon is recognizing that there is this glaring reality in this new place they've come.
And divide. A divide
between, right? So it's different from what they're used to, right? It's different from
a divide between Sfarad and Ashkenaz.
So it's very interesting, because one can say quite emphatically that at least in the 12th century, the divide between Sfarad and Ashkenaz was specifically that there was no engagement with worldly knowledge.
Absolutely. And by the way, worldly is a little bit, it's a good term, but maybe we can enlarge it. We talk about metaphysics, poetry, the wisdom of language and dikduk, all those things that from the point of view of Sfarad are not secular knowledge the way we will describe it.
Yes.
Not at all. Not at all.
They are part of the system. They're all part of it, the way that we understand the world, and through the Torah's.
Right. Torah is embedded and is among other things one of the expressions of that world.
Right. Now I want to ask you. Let me just ask so that I can. So it's because from what I understand, and again, I thank you for your clarity on it. From what I understand, although they weren't engaging in these subjects, there were Jewish physicians in in Provence. They were artisans. They were money lenders.
Absolutely. Yeah. They
had great confidence
in commerce, but philosophy,
right,
poetry, thought, in the science in the broader sense,
right,
they didn't have any knowledge of.
Yeah.
And here it says the following. עד שנקבעה בתוכם המנורה הטהורה, נר מצווה ותורה, till they in them they had the menorah, the pure menorah, the candle and light of mitzvah and Torah. הרב הגדול החסיד הקדוש, רבן המשולם נרו יאיר, בן החכם הישיש, רבי יעקב זיכרונו לברכה. Then he says, but in them, among them, was this figure, who is very important for our story and narrative. Rabbi Meshulam ben Yaakov, who died, by the way, in 1170. Right? So he is older than the Rambam. And he says, and he praises him, look at the word, ותדבק נפשו בתורת אלוהיו ויראתו. His soul cleaved to the Torah of God and to the fear of God. ושם החוכמה כוסו ומנתו, and he put the chokhmah, wisdom, his lot and his share, ויחשוף לספרי החוכמה אשר חיברו הגאונים, and he yearned to the books of wisdom that the Geonim, meaning the great figures, etc., וכפי יכולתו קיבץ ורע, והעתיק מחוכמת התורה וחוכמת הלשון, וחוכמת האמונה, וספרי המליצות, וחיבורי המוסר, ומשלח חכמים, ותמצא ככן ידו לכל חמודותיהם. So he was engaged in translation of all Arabic, Judeo-Arabic culture to Hebrew, and now he speaks about himself, יהודה אבן טבעון. וכששמעו עתה, כי לאחד מחכמי ספרד הוא רבנו בחיי הדיין ברבי יוסף ז"ל, חיבור בתורת חובות הלבבות, יסודתו על עניין הייחוד, קנתה נפשו לראותו והגיע לידו, ציווני לתרגם לו ענייניו בלשון עברי. He says, when he heard that Bachya Ibn Pakuda wrote this book, חובות הלבבות, that his central theme is the unity of God, he commended me, or he says, he commended me to translate this, right? So here's the beginning of the encounter. It's a powerful moment. So
which
what
seems
you
nice
have,
and friendly to begin with.
exactly.
Yeah.
You have a
The
family.
beginnings were calm. Yeah.
You have a family of great rabbinic figure, Meshulam ben Yosef, and his, by the way, sons, among them Aaron, Meshulam ben Yaakov, among them Aaron, Rabbi Aaron ben Meshulam, that will be very important later for our narrative. And there is a huge translation and cultural integration of the world of Sfarad into Provence through the activity of the Tibonim.
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Now but if this was the whole story, we have a very nice story.
Right.
Right?
It didn't stop there.
Not at all. Not at all.
Yes, Provence, somebody's asking. Provence was under Christian rule.
Exactly. Under Christian
rule.
rule.
It was a place of the popes. The popes came in states.
Exactly. And this is why he calls them Artzot Edom.
Edom.
The land of Edom means the Christian land.
Yeah.
Now, I just want to say, what we see is a strong support of Judeo-Arabic Sephardic culture in Provence. By the way, just to make a point, it doesn't spill over to North France.
Right. As a matter of fact, when North France starts to spill into Southern France, it gets much, much worse. I mean,
right.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, by the way, there isn't a sharp distinction between North France and South France. What makes the distinction is the immigration of Sephardi communities into the world of Ashkenaz in Provence. Yeah. I just want to say, bracket, maybe for another conversation for you to engage in, there is another entry of Sfarad into European Ashkenaz, but later in the 16th century, 16th, 17th century, where Jews were expelled from Portugal and Spain, or left Portugal and Spain, settled in Amsterdam, Hamburg. You know, these are great Sephardi.
That's where our kahal comes from.
Exactly. Bediuk. That's a different iteration of that encounter, but it's a different iteration.
Very different. Yeah.
Now, this group of scholars and their Bet Midrash are captivated, completely captivated and swept by Sephardi world. But it meets with great resistance as well by other forces in Provence.
So essentially, they needed to, Provence experiences now, this openness to secular culture, this openness to worldly, and it had to be justified for them.
Right.
It wasn't that they took it matter of fact. They needed this to be justified. They needed this to be able to be proven, and that was.
And I wanna emphasize, this is not secular culture per se. Chovot Halvavot is not a secular book, right?
So I use that term, right? Of course, that's absolutely correct, right? In other words, I think that because you're going back on this, and I think it's important. For the Sephardi mind, at least the way that I understand it and explain it, for the Sephardi mind, the Torah is a framework for reality. And so I am looking at the entire world as an expression of God. And everything that I learn from this world is an expression of God. Whereas for many of the Jews in Provence, in Europe, the Ashkenazi world, the world is a distraction. It could be a distraction, and we have to be careful about being drawn into the distraction. I think that's a stark difference. So when I say secular, yes, I'm using the vernacular. But yes, very important point is for the Chachmei Sfarad, it wasn't secular. This was all part of their knowledge of Torah.
Right. And not only that, we have to recall.
And then I think that was the big thing in Provence, because in Provence, it was secular. In other words, it was outside the realm. It was chitzon.
Okay,
and that was
exactly. So let's continue. But what we have here is that it's also the place of reason. Is in its speculative exploration of God and the world as religiously inspiring and as religiously fundamental.
So you're, just so that we can unpack this a bit, because this is I think this is also a very, very important point. If I understand you're saying that in Sfarad, the rational, reasoned development of metaphysics was in itself part of the hitlahavut of the elahut, right?
Exactly. For example, when we look at the text we're talking about here, Chovot Halvavot, it's all about religious interiority. Right? How the exploration of the inner depth through meditative reason, which is also semi-mystical, broadens and deepens the religious world.
Yes.
Right.
And what's the contrast with the
contrast is, and it will become sharper and sharper. The contrast is that
you were saying that in Provence they were beginning with Kabbalah, and that how are they relating to
right? The contrast is seeing reason, or the world of reason, as a danger, as a source of heresy, as a potential for raising doubt, as a potential for leading us away from you might say the occult, leading us away from what we presumably traditionally accepted and received from our forefathers. It looks like an overwhelmingly risky, threatening world. It's not experienced as an integrative.
Yes, right. It's foreign and dangerous.
Threatened, exactly. It's threatened.
Right. Would you say, Professor, that that the Chachmei Provence, and again, there were different Chachamim in Provence, because not everybody was, all wearing the same color, so to speak, right? There were different opinions. Some people later ended up defending, Harambam's Torah and so on. But would you say that there was a belief, maybe by the Ravad and his kind of group, that if it wasn't found in the Torah proper, that it wasn't necessary to study. Is that an accurate statement, or is that too broad? Or too
it's a little bit. You're right.
What's the nuance in that? What's the nuance in that?
The nuance about is that the Kabbalah is not exactly found in the Torah proper.
Okay.
Right? It's a
But
symbolic.
they wanted to read into the traditional texts to be able to base all of their knowledge about life and our living in these traditional texts and keep to those.
Right. Now, so what we have now we have a base. We have an encounter, immigration. We have to remember, these are great families. We immigrate. These are the elite, the cultural elite of Andalus immigrating and finding themselves in an alien cultural world, but begin to impact it through that encounter and reception by the family of Meshulam ben Yaakov, Rabbi Meshulam ben Yaakov, his children, and other Talmidei Chachamim in Provence.
Yeah.
Now we move a little more ahead in time. Towards 1180, 1190, Mishneh Torah begins to arrive in manuscripts to Provence.
Yeah.
It crosses the Pyrenees. It reaches the Christian Jewish world, the Jewish world under Christianity, first and foremost in Provence.
Yeah.
And it's accepted in great enthusiasm among these groups, particularly in the Bet Midrash of Rabbi Yonatan HaKohen of Lunel. And they begin to exchange with Rambam in questions about Mishneh Torah. And by the way, we have beautiful letters written from Rambam to figures in Provence. By the way, I recommend for all of you to read a very important Rambam's letter. For me, it's an essential letter that the scholars of Provence ask Maimonides, what does he think about astrology? And he writes a letter concerning astrology to those rabbinic figures in Montpellier. And where he debunks astrology as a false science, as a superstition, etc., and where he states he makes a powerful statement about the constitutive role of reason in developing fear and love of God and Yahadut. It's a very important letter among the exchanges that Rambam has with them. Now they hear as well that there is Moreh Nevuchim, but it's in Arabic, which they cannot read. And they yearn to read it and learn from Rambam. And Rambam says, I don't have time. Maybe he didn't have a wish to translate it into Hebrew. But among you, there is this great translator, Shmuel ibn Tibon, who's the son of Yehuda ibn Tibon. I authorize him to translate Moreh Nevuchim for you. And at that moment, both cultural influence expands and trouble begins. Cultural war begins. And I just want to say another thing. Mishneh Torah also was received with enthusiasm and also some type of ambivalence. in Provence. And who's the great Provençal critique of the Mishneh Torah? Rabbi Avraham ben David Ravad, right? What is the first hasaga of Rabbi Avraham ben David, who's older than Maimonides? And in terms of his pure scholarship and mastery of Talmud, he can engage with Rambam one-on-one on every halacha in every field of Talmud. Yeah. He's an immense scholar.
Yes, absolutely.
And the first hasaga of Ravad, the first critical comment of Ravad on the Mishneh Torah is "Ze hamechaber savar letaken velo tiken." This author thought to improve things, but he didn't improve things. And there he expresses criticism for Maimonides not justifying his rulings either through sources, through arguments. And he says, I wish he would have justified it, because then at places that I might think that he's mistaken, maybe I would have been convinced by his arguments. But since we don't have...
He's talking about his lack of source.
Yeah.
Lack of citation, yeah.
And he says, who's this authority speaking out of nowhere? I mean, and coming to us with a book of halakha. He says he's another rabbi, another Rishon for me. And I would critically engage with him, one halakha after the other. And this idea of argument, a book that doesn't provide arguments, is actually a sign for the Ravad and others as a presumption of authority,
yes,
which is undeserved.
Yes. Yeah.
Also, so we have a reaction to that, and we have as well a response to a cultural battle in response to the first book of Mishneh Torah, Sefer Hamada.
Because there you've got the philosophical aspects, you've got the metaphysical aspects, and that's a taste of what they would otherwise find in the Moreh Nebuchim, which was
exactly.
Much right.
And we have as well now.
No, I mean, I think people don't realize. I want to just mention, when the Frankel Rambam, they published the Frankel Rambam, till this day they left Sefer Hamada last. They didn't even publish Sefer Hamada, and then they were questioning whether they would even publish Sefer Hamada with everything else.
Right.
So Ad Hayom Hazeh, there's this whole schism maintained.
Right. Now, then with Shmuel ibn Tibon's translation.
Yes.
With, by the way, Shmuel ibn Tibon radical reading of the guide.
Yes, right. It's true.
Philosophical.
Mm-hmm.
In 1232, Rambam dies in 1204. There erupts a cultural war.
Yes.
In Provence around Rambam.
I think it's important as well also to recognize that during that time in the 13th century in Provence, there was a lot of civil and social and ecclesiastical change even among the Christians. So there was a lot of, the waters were not settled. Yeah, in Provence.
Absolutely, that's true.
Yeah. So it was ripe, because already when was the Pope instituting the Inquisition against?
There is in Avignon, the Pope is in Avignon, and then there is the Qatari heresy, and there is a debates in the University of Paris between the Averroists and the more moderate.
But some of Greek philosophy is coming to be known by the Christians as well now. Yeah.
Exactly, because at the same time, the Arab works are translated to Latin. Among other things, by Jewish translators in Toledo, but that's a different story of this. Jews are a bridge, cultural bridge, both to the European Jews or to the Christian Europe. But it's a story into itself. So in now a very important date for the story of Yahudut Provence is 1232, where an immense debate erupts around the Rambam's writings, in particular around Sepharadim and Moreh Nevuchim, the Guide of the Perplexed. And it's being initiated in Montpellier, and creates. We want to talk about cultural war. That's what's happening out of this encounter of Sfarad and Ashkenaz in the ground of Provence. That becomes the battleground of Jewish culture, because if those communities weren't mixed, each had its own domain. But the encounter is fierce, and by the way, we would say bloody, very ugly, very ugly. It engages bans, it engages burning of books, but it engages also appeals to the Christian community to interfere with its own coercive, brutal force into this internal Jewish debate used by every side.
I mean, that in and of itself, I must say, I mean, it's known, but it's so shocking.
It is shocking.
That it would get to a point that they would turn, Rambam's books over to the Inquisition, to that time. It's. What are your thoughts on that? I want to ask you, like, what do you think the implications of that were? What were the ripple effects of it?
So now to add to that, and now to add to that, and we want to add to that the other side of it, which we talked about Kabbalah. Kabbalah, and there was a question here, Kabbalah prior to the Zohar. The Zohar becomes known in 1270. Right? We're talking about almost 100 years later, or 70 years later, or 50 years later in Castilia. But we have the first Kabbalistic texts known to us of Yitzhak Sagi Naor, his commentary on Sefer Yetzirah. His students then moved from Provence to Catalonia, and they are in Girona. We're talking about Azriel, Ezra, Rabbi Azriel, Rabbi Ezra, and then Nachmanides. All these are students of Kabbalists from Provence. Provence is the birthplace of Kabbalah, as well as a center of Maimonidean culture in Christian Europe, among Jewish communities in Christian Europe. So it's a fierce thing. And we have testimony of the burning of Kabbalistic texts by Maimonides supporters. Right? I just want to say, just to get a sense of the tension among the rabbinic elites, where Meiri, who lives far later, 40 years later, 50 years later, says, "Umeaz ruach Hashem diber banu," since the Spirit of God spoke to us. בהגיע ספרי הרב מפורי צדק בארץ, when Maimonides' writings, Rambam's writing came to Provence, look at the terms, רוח Hashem דיבר בנו, right? The acceptance of Sfarad in Provence, in Ashkenaz. נמצאו בגלילתנו חכמים וגדולים ומפורסמים בתורה ובכל מיני מעלה, בקיאים בכל סדרי התלמוד והמשנה, עם ידיהם עושות תושייה בחוכמה וספריה, ומצאו חקר תבונתה וסתריה. He says, since Rambam's arrival of his work, we have an integration of philosophy and halacha in our world, in Provence. So those scholars are resisting the Kabbalistic and other forces, the anti-Maimonidean forces, and they're clashing with one another. And by the way, they themselves also ban Kabbalistic books, claiming that they're worse than the Christian, because the Christians have Trinity and they have 10 Sephirot.
Right. That's the
You know, they don't support the unity of God. So you have a cultural clash, and we can talk a lot about 1232, but just to make a point that will haunt Provence from then onwards. When the local rabbis who tried to ban Rambam's books in Provence don't succeed, they appeal to support to the Tosafists north of them in France. They appeal to their support. And by the way, Maimonides, the Rambam's supporters, appeal to Spain Jewry to support them. Now, when you have outside forces engaging, usually it radicalizes the debate.
Yes.
Right? Because, you know, what do the French Tosafists know about the world of Rambam? You know, they just read the Sefer Ramadan and they say, this is complete heresy. They don't know the context. They don't know. I want to talk. I want to talk just about one person's intervention in this debate in 1232, which is Nachmanides Ramban, Moshe ben Nachman, who at the time is a great figure and lives in Barcelona. And he intervenes, writing a letter to the Tosafists in France to get their own hands off.
Yes.
And not
an amazing letter. It's an amazing letter, yeah.
Right? What a letter. I wish it's a letter to read very carefully.
Yes.
It's a masterpiece.
Yes.
He says to them, essentially, you're so foreign to the culture of the Rambam, and then you don't understand his great achievement and what he had contributed to Yadut.
Yeah, he says, Rabim Hishiv Me'avon.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then he says, do you think if you ban him, that will have any force in world Jewry? He says in Yemen, they mention Rambam in Kaddish de Rabbanan.
Kaddish, yeah. The Kaddish.
Yeah. I mean, what do you think you're doing?
Yeah. It's a remarkable letter. It's amazing that letter is not more famous. You know, it's not more well known, but it's just unbelievable.
Unbelievable letter. So, by the way, Rambam, the supporters of Rambam have the upper hand.
Yes.
In that clash.
I mean, there was a time, was there not, and where there really was this ban with the Rishba and so on studying until you were a certain age.
No, we are now, we're moving, right, now we're moving to a different iteration. If we want to talk some more about Provence in later periods.
Yeah.
And
okay, so I don't want to rush, and I'm sensitive to time. So at this point with Ramban Nachmani, the supporters of Harambam had a bit of the upper hand.
Right.
Okay, so
now we have a strong parallel. By the way, Kabbalah then is forced to move from Provence. It's interesting. And there is almost a change of places where philosophy now gets the upper hand in Provence, and Kabbalah moves to Catalonia, to Spain. There is a substitution of places in some very interesting way, right? And in Provence, you have figures who are children and great children of the Tibonite family, figures like Rabbi Yaakov ben Machir, Rabbi Yaakov Anatoli, all this. Levi ben Yitzchak, Liviat Chen. There is a huge work of translating philosophical Arabic works to Hebrew and adding systematic interpretation of Torah and Talmud in line with Rambam's worldview through the 13th century. The great manifestation, the great jewel of combining halacha and philosophy in Provence towards the end of the 13th century is Meiri, Shlomo ben Menachem HaMeiri, whose book Bet Abchira, if we read it, is really thoroughly embedded in Rambam's worldview. And here we come to a second cultural clash. And we're talking, now we are 70 years forward, 1304, where you have a flourishing philosophical Maimonidean culture in Provence. And there is a figure called Abba Mari, who's a great rabbi. He says he went to a wedding, and in the wedding, someone gave a sermon and said that Abraham is form and Sarah is matter. He did philosophical allegories reading the Torah in public. And he says, Atkan, enough is enough. And he wants to issue a ban on philosophical sermons and on the study of philosophy at a young age. And he fails to issue the ban internally, and he does what was done before. He appeals this time to Barcelona, to Rashba, Rabbi Shlomo ibn Adret, who's now the great halachist of world Jewry.
Yes. Nero shel olam. Rabbi Yosef Karo says he's Nero shel olam.
Exactly, exactly. And he's not a friend of philosophy. And at the beginning, he hesitates to intervene in the internal debate of Provence. He also remembers the scars of what happened in 1232. It's all in the memory. But he's drawn into it, slowly drawn into it. I just want to say, and then a huge second iteration of a cultural war erupts in Provence between those who support the philosophical curriculum and philosophical, we would say, training, education, and integration of philosophy and religion in the Rambam's approach, and we would say the opponents, though it's a little bit complicated to demarcate the camps exactly. But the opponents appeal to the Rashba. By the way, at the moment the opponents appeal to the Rashba, it stops to be an internal debate among moderate or radical Maimonideans in Provence, and it begins to be a war.
Yeah, it's world Jewry, whatever it is at that time. But it's because it's touched by the Rashba.
Exactly. Yeah. And I just want to say, just to give you a sense of the nature, what's at stake at this debate. There is a practice, a medical practice called Sefer Atzurot, the Book of Forms, that uses astrology and astral magic in order to heal different ailments and illnesses that people have. They use, for example, Tzurat Aryeh, a lion-shaped figure, in order to heal kidney problems. Assuming that this shape draws astral forces, a certain type, we will call in today's language, energy, that heals the body. Now, in line with the Maimonidean halacha, with Rambam's halacha, the supporters of Rambam prohibit that practice as prohibited from the Torah, because it is a form of magic. It's a form of lo tenachashu, lo tonenu, etc. All the prohibitions of magic appeal to that. Because Rambam, in his halachic work, in chapter 11 of Ilchot Avodah Zarah, in his great Mishnah Torah, prohibits the uses of medical practices that are not grounded in reason, that are grounded in the occult. And the issue of Tzurat Aryeh becomes a symbol of the great cultural war that is tearing Provence apart between the Maimonideans and the anti-Maimonideans in 1304. Now, we're telling all this story because it's fascinating. People think that the Rambam, as a philosopher, was a relatively marginal figure, but as a halachist, he had a lot of impact, etc., etc. But that's not accurate. Not in the 13th, not in the 14th century, and in particular, where Rambam's world was alive and flourishing among not the assimilated courtly Jews of Spain, but among rabbinic elites and great Talmidei Chachamim. It is in Provence.
Yes.
So this is, I would say, that's a point to give a whole picture, because we're talking about 150 years of complex encounter of Sfarad and Ashkenaz in Provence that makes, for me, Provence the most interesting, vibrant place that reflects the different worlds of world Jewry at the time. I just want to say,
and how they come together.
Exactly.
And I mean, it's important for us, I think, especially here in the Habura, but I think it's important for us to be able to examine that period. And I'm so grateful again to you, Professor, for coming on to kind of present this together with us. But it's so important to be able to examine that period, because a lot of the things that we experience in the modern Jewish world, in the modern, observant world also, we think that these are new arguments or that these are new elements, but the reality is that this has been going on a very long time, and there are deep roots to much of what it is that we experience today.
Absolutely.
And so I wonder, what would you say, I hope this is a fair question, and we're coming close to the end of time, and so I think, well, Ohad, are we going to open for questions, or?
Whenever, if there's time.
I don't know how the professor, but I'm going to ask the professor this question. What would you say are some of the key lessons, 2, 3 key lessons that you would suggest we pay attention to coming out of all that we've just presented from Provence, right? This confluence of cultures, this confluence of approach to Torah, the fights, the burning of books, the conflicts that we're drawing people in. If you had to, what are some of the key lessons that you would suggest are important for us to remember today, looking at that and studying from history?
So I would say three lessons.
Hmm.
First of all, we have different different worldview
Hmm.
of what is Jewish life and what constitutes Jewish life
Hmm.
in the medieval period. And there is no one Judaism.
Okay.
There is the Jewish world of Andalus, the Jewish world of Ashkenaz, the Jewish world of Provence, Kabbalah. We have diverse Jewish worlds. We have Ibn Ezra. There is a huge diversity and plurality of what is Yahadut, accelerating and developing in the 11th, 12th century. Let's start with that lesson.
Okay. Yeah.
Nobody can claim there is one authentic way of thinking and seeing God and the world and Torah in our history.
Yeah.
We start with that fact.
Okay.
By the way, including a fierce alternatives of what is the secret of Torah, what is the sod.
Yes.
Because for Maimonides, the sod of Torah is wisdom, is philosophy, is metaphysics. For the Kabbalists, the sod of Torah is the Sfirot, etc., etc. For Ibn Ezra, by the way, the sod of Torah is a certain type of astrology and divine astrology, etc., that Maimonides dismisses, etc., etc. But what we have, and then we have Rashi that has a Judaism with no secrets.
Right.
Right. But what we have is a plentitude, radical plentitude of perceiving, understanding, and living Yahadut.
Lovely. That's lesson one. The plurality.
The plurality, and that plurality is an outcome, among other things, of the embeddedness of Jews in their own realm.
Yes.
In the way
So if I understand what you mean by that, you're saying it's a form almost of speciation, right? In other words, you've got Jews that are separated and isolated, and they've developed their own. Is that what you're saying, or am I misunderstanding?
I'm saying that, and I'm also saying that it depends, the way Judaism is formed is depend, among other things, on the interaction of Jews in their environment.
Yes.
The way Yehuda Ibn Tibon begins and said, look, you might say I would put it the way then others will say it more bluntly than Yehuda Ibn Tibon would say. He would say the Ashkenazim, those who live in the north, who never see the sun. In one of the debates, they say, Yoshvei Ma'arot Tchufim, they live in caves, wet caves, right? They live in a world where they lived an impoverished cultural world among the Christians.
Yes, so in essence, as much as maybe, let's say, the some of the Chachmei Provence would want to assert that all of their world was in Torah, they could never escape the fact that they were embedded in this external environment that, of course, is going to influence. So all of the Jewish people where they
so
are.
we have the first lesson is plurality. Radical diverse readings of Torah in 11th, 12th century. By the way, Rambam plays a huge role in providing an alternative, in establishing one of the alternatives, as we saw, and some of the diversity is an outcome of the engagement of Chachamim with their environment.
Yes.
Okay.
Lesson two.
Lesson two has to do with the fact, very important, that Sfarad not as a cultural category.
Mhm.
Sfarad is a cultural category. Now we talk mainly about Rambam's world. Has a deep, in its philosophical outlook, has a deep continuity
Mhm.
in Provence and among rabbinic elites, and it's far more rooted and deep than what different people, historians, and other things about Rambam's world,
That's an important one. That's an important one. Yeah.
right?
So,
You read,
it was much more, there was a very strong significance of Rambam's Torah in Provence than people might attribute to it.
and not only among, marginal non-Talmidei Chachamim philosophers,
Yes.
like Ibn Kaspi or Yaakov Anatoli, etc. We're talking about great Talmidei Chachamim. Let's take, we all read Bet Abchira of Meiri. We know what a Talmid Chacham he is.
Mhm.
He's a giant.
Yes.
That's the second lesson. The third lesson is, now we come to internal conflicts.
Mhm.
Is, can this radical diversity reside side by side together in the same cultural communal space?
Mm. Mm.
And that's the challenge of Provence.
Mm.
Or you might say to some degree, the failed experiment.
Yeah. I mean, it would seem, if we're studying history, it was either one or the other that was kind of in charge.
Right.
I don't know that there was ever a time that they were in harmony, would you say?
So we have to look for a figure like Ramban, who's, by the way, a Kabbalist through and through,
Mhm.
Moshe ben Nachman,
Ahmad, yeah.
yeah, who seeks some sort of spiritual, political, communal coexistence.
Mhm.
And the third lesson has to do with,
Let me ask you this. Would you say that he came closest to doing that? Who came closest to doing that?
he came closest because he had the scope
Mhm.
of the view of Jewish culture in its totality. By the way, it's interesting. We talk about diverse Jewish lives,
Mhm.
and you ask themselves: is there someone who sees all the diversity and understands it from within?
Mhm.
That's Moshe ben Nachman.
So that's very interesting because, it's very likely that, staunch Maimonideans would reject that there should be synthesis, as would the other side, they would say there should be synthesis. But nonetheless, the Ramban Nachmani seems to have believed that this was something that should have a confluence in harmony.
Right. He doesn't think of a synthesis, but he thinks that we have to strive to understand the value for Jewish life of positions we disagree with.
Okay.
He says, look, I'm not a Maimonidean. I'm not a Rambamist.
Right.
But I'm not going to ban Rambam.
Yeah.
I'm not going to excommunicate.
He recognizes the value of Rambam's presence in the Jewish dialogue and study.
Exactly. So these are the three.
Okay, those are big. Those are important lessons, Professor.
Yes.
Those are important lessons. Well, I have to say, and it is an understatement to say, that it is a tremendous privilege always to be able to speak with you, to learn from you, to share this time with you, and it's an honor for us. Thank you again. I know it's very late in the Aretz, in Eretz Hamda, but so your sacrifice and contribution is 10 times more than usual. And we thank you so much for your dedication and care to the Habura, to the learning, to the Talmud Torah, and to the broadening of our.
And may your Chavura flourish in learning and in understanding and.
Amen. Amen. Thank you, Professor. Thank you. And please, God, we look forward to more. But until then, L'chaim Tovim, Briut.
Thank you. Toda.
Thank you, everyone. Good night. Good night.
Thank you.